And today's our guest is Dr. Andy Norman. We're very fortunate to have him talk with us. His latest appearances include Skeptical Inquirer Presents, Secular Student Alliance, and Houston Oasis. And he recently facilitated online conversations about evolutionary thinking and its applications for the Evolution Institute. And then he even had time to write a review of Rutger Berman's Humankind for the April-May issue of Free Inquiry magazine. If you don't get Free Inquiry, I suggest you try to get it from your library. It's a very interesting magazine. That's the most recent issue. And he works on the emerging science of mental immune health. He's currently testing a mind vaccine, in the hope to inoculate minds against the worst form of ideological contagion. So it's going to be, I think, quite an interesting discussion and discussion, talk. And so, Dr. Norman, you now have the screen.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Judy. Can you all nod if you can hear me okay? It's all good? All right. Very good. So I'd like to share with you a simple idea, an exciting new science based on that idea, and why I think the two of them are going to pretty radically change the human condition for the better. So here's the idea. Minds have immune systems just as bodies have immune systems. But where bodily immune systems protect us from infectious microbes, mental immune systems protect us from infectious ideas. Now, infectious ideas, in fact, all bad ideas, are arguably, or in effect, mind parasites. Think about it for a second. An idea needs a mind to host it. An idea can take up residence in a mind and begin to create copies of itself, and even induce the mind to help spread copies of it to other minds. And bad ideas are harmful to their hosts almost by definition. Get into why I qualify that with the almost later, if you like. So I think the claim that bad ideas are mind parasites is very close to literally true, and possibly even in the process of becoming literally true as language norms change. Meanwhile, the idea that minds have immune systems strikes many as metaphorical. But here again, the case for taking such language as literal is much stronger than is commonly supposed. Just as our bodies evolved systems to spot and remove harmful pathogens, I think our minds actually evolved to spot and remove harmful ideas. Now, they function imperfectly, just as our bodily immune systems function imperfectly. And so our minds can become infected with ideas that actually harm us as believers and thinkers. And of course, sometimes infectious ideas gain the upper hand and spread through populations in ways that do great damage to our collective well-being. In fact, the World Health Organization has recently begun using the concept of an infodemic to describe how, say, anti-vax ideas spread around the world and actually create serious obstacles to effectively combating the coronavirus, the COVID pandemic. Let me say a little bit about the science based on this idea. We can study mental immune systems the same way we do any other natural system. We can ask, how do they work? We can ask, why do they sometimes fail? What compromises or diminishes their functioning? And we can ask, what kinds of things can we do to improve mental immune function? In fact, I think one of my favorite questions is, what can we do to fortify mental immune systems against the kind of corruption that we're seeing happen in our time? Now, the science of mental immunity actually goes back about 60 years to the work of a man named William McGuire, who shortly after the end of the Korean War, he got interested. There was a series of news headlines at the time when 9 American POWs decided against returning to America after the Korean War ended. In fact, they decided to stay in North Korea. And this was just unthinkable to many people in America, and in particular in the American intelligence and military communities. And they immediately concluded that North Koreans must have some advanced form of brainwashing techniques. Because why would any good red-blooded American choose to live in North Korea? Young, ambitious psychologist at the time, William McGuire, noticed that a bunch of his colleagues in psychology were studying the art of persuasion and the psychology of persuasion. And so he decided to look at the flip side. How do we create resistance to persuasion? So he studied this and he made a really fascinating discovery. He found that if you expose a mind to a weakened form of an argument, the mind will often develop resistance to even stronger and even sound versions of the same argument. So if you, for example, take a young person and give them a weak argument for secularism, and then ridicule and diminish it, poke holes in it, the young impressionable mind will often prove highly resistant to secular beliefs more generally. So McGuire published his findings. He became very influential in the world of psychology. And since then, there have been hundreds of studies done on what he called, or based on what he called, inoculation theory, because of course, McGuire saw the analogy between bodily inoculation and mental inoculation. So he actually talked about these interventions that expose people to weakened form of arguments as mind inoculation. Interestingly, McGuire never drew, so he definitely observed that minds behave as if they have immune systems, but he never drew what to me is the obvious conclusion: minds really do have immune systems. It turns out that McGuire's findings reveal that if you know what you're doing, it's actually extraordinarily easy to hack other people's mental immune systems. So propagandists who bother to study psychology quickly learned that you can expose an American mind to a silly argument for communism and cause that American to become dead set anti-communist. Not in all cases, but in a significant percentage of cases. People in marketing have been using some of the same techniques that McGuire helped to identify. I'm going to break here for a little story, and you'll see the relevance of the story in a little bit. I'm told that this story is true, but you'll have to decide for yourself if it is. So Fred the flat earther dies and goes to heaven. St. Peter meets him at the gates and say, "Hey, you're lucky customer number 100 today. You get to chat with God personally." So Fred steps into God's inner chamber and says, "God, it's so nice to meet you. I've been a flat earther all my life, and I really have to ask you, tell me, God, is the earth flat or is the world round?" God shakes his head gravely and said, "Fred, I'm sorry to break the news, but the world is most definitely round." Fred's face registers shock and then realization. this conspiracy goes higher than I thought. Now, that story, I think, is funny in part because it reveals something we all kind of know to be true about flat eartherism and conspiracy thinking more generally, which is that minds can become so good at poking holes in information, so good at becoming skeptical and suspicious and even cynical, that you can take critical thinking way farther than is healthy. You can become too skeptical for your own good. It turns out that being too skeptical for your own good is rooted in an autoimmune disorder of the mind. Autoimmunity, of course, is what happens when the body's immune system goes into overdrive and starts attacking the body itself or nutrients within it, the good stuff. The body's immune system is supposed to attack the bad stuff and leave the good stuff alone, but an overactive immune system will actually attack the body itself, or things that, or say beneficial bacteria within your body. And in just the same way, Fred the Flat Earther has a mind where his mental antibodies, namely questions and doubts, actually attack good information about the shape of the planet. And I actually think that that phenomenon is widespread these days. We see it in QAnon, conspiracy thinking. We see it in science denial. We see it in the enormously divisive political ideologies that are flourishing in America today. And I think all of these phenomena are rooted in what we might as well call mental immune disorders. In fact, I think that's the most illuminating description of the root cause of these phenomena that I've come across. And I argue that that way of framing the problem points to solutions in ways that prior descriptions of those problems do not. I'll say more about that in a minute. So the science of mental immunity, I call it cognitive immunology, I think has the potential to take us far beyond what I call the critical thinking paradigm. For about 100 years, people in higher education, at least, have taken the concept of critical thinking and the idea that we should impart critical thinking skills. We've been doing that for about 100 years now, and it's, I think, now patently clear that it's simply not enough to inoculate minds against really dangerous forms of ideological contagion, not in the internet age. We need to be doing more, and the science of mental immunity, I think, clarifies what more we can be doing. It clarifies in particular that mental immune health involves much more than critical thinking skills. And in fact, the misapplication of critical thinking, you could argue that Fred the Flat Earther was misapplying critical thinking skills to buttress and support his flat earth position. And in just the same way, the merchants of doubt about climate change and the merchants of doubt about the health, about the carcinogenic effects of tobacco, they were essentially weaponizing critical thinking skills. And so I think it's time for people in higher education, my colleagues in higher education, to pretty dramatically rethink how we teach critical thinking. And in fact, we need to go beyond the language of critical thinking to really get it right. An alarming, I think a particular fact illuminates how far short of our goal higher education is falling. 43% of American college graduates voted for Donald Trump in 2016, even though it was patently obvious to anybody who knows how to think well that he was unfit for the job. So if you take this idea of mental and immune health seriously, and start studying the phenomena of mass irrationality, or even more localized, smaller versions of unreason, you start to see things that, it's certainly true of me, that I started to see things I had missed for years and years and years. It turns out that there are some very influential ideas at large in our culture that actually disrupt healthy mental immune function. Just give an example. The idea that everyone is entitled to their opinion has been accepted on both the left and the right for hundreds of years. And although that might be true in a legal sense, that we're all legally entitled to our opinions, it's definitely not true that we're all morally entitled to our opinions. I'm not morally entitled to indulge in misogynistic fantasies and homophobic delusions. That's just not morally acceptable. And the prevailing idea that we're entitled to our opinions excuses unreasonable, irresponsible thinking and believing. So I call this idea a mental immune disruptor. And in the book, Mental Immunity, I identify 5 other very common and very influential mental immune disruptors, and I challenge my readers to help eliminate them from the meme pool, because as long as they continue circulating, new generations are going to be infected with those immune disruptive ideas, and their mental immune systems will be compromised. I mentioned earlier that the World Health Organization is talking openly now about infodemics. In fact, a good friend of mine, Lee McIntyre, is a philosopher of science who went undercover at a flat Earth convention, tells a wonderful story about that and his attempt to actually catch a prominent flat earther in a contradiction in a book he'll be releasing in a few months called How to Talk to a Science Denier. But he now appears in a documentary just released by the Aspen Institute called Infodemic, that's basically saying one of the biggest threats to humanity and our collective, our sustainable well-being right now is the spread of disinformation, misinformation across the internet. Now, there's 2 different ways you might address that, at least 2 ways you might try to address that problem. One thing you might do is try to shut down the internet. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen. The other thing you can do is actually strengthen mental immune systems against the kind of infections that right now spread with little control through social media and online. I take this notion of an infodemic, and it tempts me to posit the germ theory of cognitive contagion, in the same way that the germ theory of disease arose in the 18th century and gave us a completely different approach to addressing some of the biggest challenges to human health. I think the germ theory of cognitive contagion is going to transform our relationship to self-replicating packets of information that thrive at our expense. Smallpox, polio, the Black Plague, these things used to flourish and spread through human populations, killing tens, hundreds of millions of people and causing suffering we can barely imagine today. And then the germ theory of disease came along, the science of immunology came along, and we've saved probably more than 1 billion lives through applications of the science of immunology. If the science of cognitive immunology follows a similar path, I think we can state with some confidence that we can dramatically improve the human condition through the intelligent application of the principles of cognitive immunology. And I envision a day, a decade or 2, maybe 3 down the road, where outbreaks of mass irrationality are dramatically curtailed or contained because we simply understand better how to prevent these self-replicating mind parasites from harming human well-being. One of the things I discovered in the course of writing this book, Mental Immunity, was that the mind's immune system seems to have like a linchpin, or put it another way around, an Achilles heel. Reason only works to educate and enlighten minds if they're willing to yield to better reasons. So in any dialogue where both parties try to defend a view or persuade the other, no such dialogue can possibly live up to its potential without the norm that says, if you have the better reason, I will back down and change my mind. But if I have the better reasons, you're supposed to back down and change your mind. Without that norm in place, dialogue simply doesn't work. And when dogmatic religions come along and say that faith is a virtue and that it's okay to believe things even in the face of contrary evidence, they're essentially defying that essential pivotal norm and compromising mental immune systems. In a famous debate between Bill Nye, the science guy, and Ken Ham, the creator of Answers in Genesis, this is back in 2014, so 7 years ago, the moderator of the debate asked both men, what would change your mind? Bill Nye said evidence, and he went on to explain like 4 or 5 different kinds of evidence that would actually overturn evolutionary theory the way we know it, as we currently know it. And then Ken Ham, the evangelical, had his turn, and he said nothing. Nothing is going to change nothing is going to convince me that the word of God is not true. He was essentially saying, I willfully defy this elemental cultural norm to protect beliefs that I cherish. I argue in the book that when that kind of defiance spreads through a population, thinking and all kinds of social, all the mechanisms designed to reconcile discrepant points of view start to go haywire, and you get outbreaks of partisanship that can tear at the fabric of a society. So one of the more interesting applications of that view is that we should be raising every child to treat the responsibility to adjust your thinking in response to the evidence or the better reason as an almost sacred duty. Of every single candidate I've ever come across for idea that deserves to be treated as sacred or semi-sacred, this one comes the closest to me as to deserve that kind of status. The John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, once said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? He was taking a stand for what I call reason's fulcrum, the idea that we must yield to better reasons. I call that a fulcrum because reasons are like levers, and we use them to pry ideas out of each other's heads and shoehorn other ideas into our heads. And when that norm doesn't prevail, when that fulcrum isn't there, reasons cease to function, perform their lever-like function. I also argue in the book that the so-called Socratic, the Socratic method is one of the most beautiful and brilliant mind inoculants ever invented. If you learn to test ideas with questions and let go of the ones that don't withstand scrutiny, that can do more to strengthen your mental immune system, I think, than just about anything. But just as the father of immunology took the cowpox vaccine, processed it, and developed it into the smallpox, he took the cowpox virus, which is a relatively harmless cousin of smallpox. And from it, he developed something that we now call the smallpox vaccine. And this guy, Edward Jenner, English doctor, has probably saved his work has probably saved hundreds of millions of lives. But my point is that a vaccine differs from a mere inoculant can be just something you stumble upon. A vaccine is something that's carefully developed and refined and strengthened in order to create a kind of deep immunity to a certain kind of pathogen. And I argue in the book that you can take the Socratic method, refine it, and turn it into a general purpose mind vaccine that could save future generations enormous amounts of suffering. Why don't I pause there? I think Judy asked me to go about half an hour. I think I've said most of my piece, but I would love to hear your questions and turn this into a back and forth.
Okay, thank you so much. I know people have to have questions because I have thought of a lot of things I wanted to ask. Anybody ready to ask their question? No, don't be shy. Michael?
Yeah, when we're talking about, talking to people that have different opinions of you, sometimes you're not just talking about different opinions, but they're also coming from different worldviews. Just by way of explanation, I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I tend to look at things culturally. So as far as this, the idea of, mind inoculation, you're saying about, presenting better evidence. Well, it's like a Christian, the better evidence would be this is the Bible's inerrantly true. Whereas to me, that's not going to be evidence.
Right.
So, I mean, we're both arguing from a point of view where we both think we have the better evidence.
Yes.
So, I mean, how would I like go about immunizing somebody from like that, coming from that worldview? And how would I convince them not just that their evidence is wrong, but I mean, their worldview? I mean, you're basically telling them their worldview is wrong.
Yeah, so I don't have any quick silver bullet way to deconvert religious evangelicals. And in fact, I think we should get away from the hope that there is any easy answers there. But clearly, one of the things that we need to talk about and explore, and by we, I mean religious and non-religious people from different subcultures, we need to have an honest, open discussion about what the evidence means and what it should mean. There are people who will grasp onto concepts of evidence that allow them to think that their views are evidence-based. But if you take a close look at their concepts of evidence, they turn out to be they result in a poorly functioning search for truth. So just take for example, the idea that faith is a good and rational thing to do. If my faith leads me to believe in this God and your faith leads you to believe in this other God, and we have to coexist on a small planet and work out our differences, then the idea that everyone should be entitled to their articles of faith is clearly not going to cut it, because it doesn't allow us to bridge ideological divides. So you can use an argument like that to say, you know what, faith is deeply problematic just from a purely practical point of view in terms of how we reconcile our differences. So if you're really interested in dialogue and resolution and harmony between people, you really can't run around saying I'm entitled to my articles of faith. Not unless you can spell out a concept of faith that will move us in the direction of consensus. And right now, and the concept of faith has, for thousands of years, the idea that faith is a virtue has been pulling people apart. I mean, it pulls subgroups together, but it isolates subgroup from subgroup and leads them to have sort of mutually incompatible worldviews. And that's not a recipe for collective flourishing, I don't think. Should I
answer your question, Michael? Sorry, I was muted.
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you. Karen? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I've been, oh.
Yeah,
Brad's
please,
going
Karen.
first?
Yes, please. Yeah, please
Karen,
ask
go
away.
ahead.
Oh, okay. I understood that Brad was going first. Okay. I'm coming back to what you said before about the more, we are legally entitled, but not morally entitled to one's own opinion. Okay. I think one of the problems that I see here, I lived abroad for many, many years, and upon returning to the United States, that what really sort of irks me is that the actual division of state and religion is much, the division is less strong than it was when I was growing up here. I think that pledging allegiance to the flag or God Save America and all that was part of a more cultural way of looking at things in a simpler time. Whereas today, it just really bothers me that everything is, you know, God bless America and my fellow Americans, and God bless this and God bless that, you know. And the more politics uses religion to garner the support of certain people, the more difficult it becomes to actually have a dialogue of reason rather than just merely saying yes, but you know, if you don't believe in God, you can't even, you're not even morally on the level to have a discussion with me, you know. And that is something that I really have a hard time dealing with.
Me too.
And yeah, it's just, and so, you know, it also leads to the fact that we can reason and say we want dialogue, but if there's a hardened position that the entire United States is based on the belief that God has founded it and God is the one, you know, leading the way, basically morally, if not legally in some cases. I mean, if we look at topics like abortion and other issues, or even to the point where you can't get a vaccine because it was tested on abortion material. It's a slippery slope that to me makes it just about impossible to have a rational dialogue.
I agree, Karen. And I think that's a fine point. And I've felt that way for a long time. And I think what the language of cognitive immunology adds to this is it provides almost a scientific way of saying, look, conducting your cognitive affairs in the way that the fundamentalist preachers tell you to, it's unhealthy. It's unhealthy for the body politic. It's unhealthy for us as a culture, as a society, and it's unhealthy for you personally. And I can show you why, because it's actually compromising your own mind's immune system. So one of the really interesting findings in recent years, actually this was just last year, a research team out of Canada led by Gordon Pennycook discovered that if your religion causes you to give up on the idea, on the, he calls it the meta belief, that beliefs should change in response to evidence. So if the idea that your belief should change in response to evidence is firmly entrenched in your mind, you have a certain amount of immunity to bad ideas, to conspiracy thinking or science denial. But if that idea gets displaced by your religion, you become more susceptible to conspiracy thinking, more susceptible to QAnon belief, more susceptible to fringe climate views, more susceptible to divisive ideologies. So, and these arguments can be presented in ways that hopefully will reach at least young people, so that, I mean, I don't know how much hope I hold for diehard and aged religious ideologues. There are ways to reach them, but it's very hard. It's much easier to pre-bunk than it is to debunk. Much easier to inoculate a mind than to cure a mind infection.
Thank you, Dr. Norman. Joe, you have a question? Comment? You're muted, Joe.
I thought I had done that. Okay, backpedaling for just a moment to the idea that faith is a virtue.
Yeah.
It seems to me that faith is by definition the absence of knowledge. And so far as I know, religion is the only discipline that teaches us that ignorance is an accomplishment.
I like that way of putting it. Yeah, so in my more conciliatory moods, I qualify my claim about faith being a bad, I qualify my thoughts about faith being a bad thing. I actually think we can distinguish between good faith and bad faith. So trust is, by and large, trust is a good thing. Hope is a good thing. Resolute hopefulness is a good thing. Loyalty is, for the most part, a good thing. A lot of times people use the word faith as kind of a near synonym for these things. And when a religious person tells somebody else who's in despairing, stay strong, have faith, they might as well be saying, be resolutely hopeful. That's okay. I approve of attempting to bolster people's spirits with appropriate language. The problem happens when the concept of faith gains a degree of positive association from its relationships with hope and trust and loyalty, and then gets used to excuse closed-minded dogmatism.
I have W.K. Clifford's quote on that subject right here. It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence.
I love that quote, and I devote a whole chapter of my book to a famous debate between W.K. Clifford and William James, the psychologist who authored a very influential rebuttal to Clifford. I end up arguing, Joe, I think I come down more on Clifford's side of it, but I actually end up arguing that James had an important piece of the overall truth there, and that we need to learn from both men to reconcile, to build a bridge that can allow us to resolve the differences between religious and non-religious folks.
I'm glad we're in agreement.
But isn't there something we can do to solve the difference between the religious and the other religious? I grew up in a fundamentalist church where if you didn't belong to my church, you were going to hell, and you weren't to be considered anything. The bombing just recently in Kabul, I think it was, where the wrong kind of Islamic groups exist. There's as much effort. I don't know how we cover that gap between being the right religion and being non-religious. It's almost as much a heretical to be in this group and not be in any group.
Yeah, that's right.
Amy, you have a question?
Hi. Thanks for your talk, and I'm
Thank you.
eager for your book. You mentioned earlier, I believe, that younger minds can benefit from this better than older minds, or just more adaptable to it, or more, what's the word I'm looking for?
Yeah, more receptive, more open.
Yes, there you go. Okay, so does that mean any of us over the age of reason are lost because our minds as well were molded in that same stage of receptibility?
No, I don't think that people of your and my age are beyond all hope. I think that statistically, we tend to be more set in our ways than very young people. But there are ways to keep your mind supple as you age. And one of them, by the way, is to continually learn from challenging ideas and evidence. Things that challenge your point of view and force you to refine it more day in and day out, that keeps your mind supple. And the fact that you're here in a free thinkers forum, Amy, leads me to think that your mind is probably supple enough to benefit from the inoculation and mind vaccine techniques that I offer. I guess what I'm saying is that deconverting the cult of Trump is going to be really hard, but raising the next generation to be mentally supple and responsive to evidence is an order of magnitude.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. I would. Hello, who's saying?
I got it.
Okay.
Sorry.
Question along with that, I guess, that goes with that is that, you know, truth is a big part of this, right? And I just got off a phone call where a Zoom call where people were talking about truth being relative, and no, you know, and that's a no-no. But
By the way,
between you and I and probably everybody on this call, that's a no-no. That is just, that's insane to say that.
Hey, Amy, can I give you some language to say that? Relativism is actually a mental immune disruptor. When you embrace relativistic views, you can no longer, your mind will no longer function as well to sort out good and bad ideas. So that's a more clinical way of saying the same thing, but it actually sheds light on how relativism disrupts mental function. I'm sorry to have interrupted. I just wanted to.
No. Yeah, I just feel like there's no way someone's going to get on TV the way Barack Obama did at the Democratic convention and make people sit up straight and say, whoa, I'm listening now. Is that ever going to happen again? And that was on a mass scale where people had hope. Okay. I think that's what I thought. I thought he made us hope. I talk about, you know, one-on-one stuff, but it's never going to happen. Are we doomed? Do you have hope?
I do.
You do. Okay.
Hey, a lot of people, back when the Black Death was killing off a third of the Europe's population, a lot of people were saying we're doomed. And then the science of immunology came along and led to human flourishing like they couldn't have imagined back then. Right now, a lot of us feel like the world is going to hell in a handbasket with crazy forms of thinking, and cognitive immunology is going to ride in on a white horse and help our children and our grandchildren have a much brighter future. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
And have you talked to Oprah yet about this?
If any of you know how to introduce me to Oprah, please.
Oh, you'd have a great conversation with her. I'll see if I
Thank
can,
you, Amy. Jim Peterson, you have a question or comment?
Thank you. I've greatly enjoyed your discussion and its full content and implication. One thing that occurred to me is that not only is it important to have facts, and I agree with Joe and yourself on this, at your disposal that are correct and coherent with the actual situation, but you need to have well-constructed arguments. That's the other half of the equation. Facts alone will not solve our problem, but our ability to think, to reason, to put things together in our head in such a way that we can arrive at a clear and logical conclusion to any given statement, I think is very important.
I couldn't agree more. I make a similar claim in the book that it's not enough to think in responsible evidence-based ways about facts. We also have to think in responsible evidence ways about values. And values aren't just picked at random, and they're not just, we're not all entitled to whatever value axioms we choose to, you know, pick off the shelf. We need to understand that our core value convictions need to withstand scrutiny, just as facts and evidence have to withstand scrutiny.
I was thinking that this is my last statement. That not only are facts and important, but logical thinking, that is to say, the machinery by which the mind processes the information at hand is critical, because we are living now in probably the most complex and material science dependent age than we have ever lived in. Most of us drive cars, we operate computers, we do an awful lot of things that we don't understand what they do, how they work. And I think it's that our education system is most inadequate to our to give us the ability to take in a wider perspective and to have more capabilities and skills than we actually possess.
That's music to my ears, Jim. I love what you're saying. I do think that my discipline, philosophy, has created a false picture of how knowledge is constructed. So empiricism, a philosophy that holds that there's sort of a foundation of our knowledge composed of empirical observations, and that everything else is constructed on top of that with logic. Well, all true knowledge is constructed on top of that with logic. Turns out that that's actually a false and misleading picture of how our knowledge is structured. Now, logic is important. I agree with you completely. Facts and evidence are important. But Descartes thought we could start with foundations and just patiently build our way up. It turns out he was wrong about that. But long before we even reach the age of reason, we've internalized thousands or tens of thousands of ideas, many of which have to do with right and wrong, or and when we start to reason, all of those things are already in play, and some of them need to be modified. So in the book, I argue that one of the things Descartes took for granted when he proposed his knowledge as an edifice idea is that all beliefs are guilty until proven innocent based on this evidential, based on this logical structure. It turns out that that sweeping generalization, every belief is guilty until shown to be innocent, or unjustified until shown to be justified, that's too indiscriminately skeptical for our own good. We actually have to learn to be more discriminating in our attribution of what needs to be evidenced, or what needs to be justified. So, but I think, I hope you'll see that as a constructive add-on to what you were saying, not as a critique in any way.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Michael?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned relativity. Of course, like I said, I'm a culture anthropologist, so relativity is at the basis of what I do. And, without relativity, I'm not really learning anything about the other person. I'm just basically exploring what I think about them. And my question's sort of related to that. It's maybe, you may cover this in the book, maybe you don't. But, there's this idea of this pure war theory, linguistic relativity, where sort of our language is kind of like a reflection of our culture. And I'm just wondering, like with, the mental immunity, with the language, so for instance, there's that famous example of like English where you say, I dropped the vase, and Spanish say the vase dropped from me. So in English, we have this sort of idea of personal responsibility, personal accountability. Have you looked at the effects of language itself on mental immunity?
No, but I love the question.
Or even the way that, framing, like Lakoff, that
Yeah.
sort of.
Yeah, that's wow. I haven't thought hard enough about that to provide, I think, any real insight. I will offer this in the way of sort of an olive branch to you as a cultural anthropologist. My sister is a cultural anthropologist, and me as a philosopher, we come at these questions of relativism from very different points of view. She understands in a very deep way, as I imagine you do, that entering another culture open to the idea that there is much that is valid and that we can learn from in it is an important way to open your own mind and learn from them. At the same time, there's a strain of thinking that goes, every culture is equally valid, or every opinion is equally valid. And I think that's the relativism that philosophers worry about, and that I think maybe Amy was referring to. It's that latter view that becomes deeply problematic because it interferes with value inquiry. You can't have a good cross-cultural dialogue about what's really best for children, say, if one party just says, our views are valid, I'm not listening to you.
Right.
Right.
Well, that's why we make a differentiation, though. We don't, relativity, there's cultural relativity and there's moral relativity. So, cultural relativity is what we use to understand the people. I mean, that doesn't mean that everything a culture does is just excused because they have an internal reasoning for doing it. Because, I mean, like you said, that would be silly. I mean, that would be, counterproductive in many ways.
Yeah. And so I suppose I ought to be careful about how to define what I mean by relativism before I dismiss it as problematic. But at least now you have that clarification.
And it's relative. I mean, it's important to understand the other point of view before you can really, inoculate. Because if you go off the analogy of inoculation, how are you going to know what you're inoculating against unless you actually have an internal emic view of what they're saying? I think that's where relativity comes into play.
Absolutely, and it's not just that you have to listen first with an open mind and an open heart, even to understand another point of view. The very process of asking non-threatening, clarifying questions has a wonderful effect on the other person, helps them open up and be less defensive themselves. So some people ask, well, how do I convince my cranky uncle, conspiracy theory infected uncle, how do I deconvert him? And my number one answer is listen, is ask clarifying questions, just try to understand his conspiratorial frame of mind. Let him open up about it. And if you do that in the right way, he'll start to see the problems in the view himself. But you have to give him a chance to hear himself think. and it's far more, and the research actually now shows this, it's far better to kind of ask gentle, clarifying questions and let that person discover the weak points and the flaws in their worldview themselves than it is to go on the attack and try to expose them. The latter just causes people to dig their heels in and push back because it triggers an mental autoimmune response. Right. But the more gentle, clarifying approach actually calms the mental immune system so that constructive dialogue can happen.
Right, because there have been studies that have shown that the more you when you engage with people, even if you show them evidence that is completely, logical, reasonable, the most common response is to become more fundamental in their views. They sort of double down on their views. And just one last thing, if I can remember what I was going to say here. You made a lot of great points. I'm still really looking forward to your book. Really,
Thank you. We can come back to you.
Are you familiar with the theory that language itself is a parasite that evolved according to the needs of people?
I might have come across that somewhere. It struck me as intriguing. So I'm sorry. So Daniel Dennett, the philosopher of mind from Tufts, he argues that words are essential, are means, are when words don't become tools in people's minds and get reused, they tend to die out. So for a word to propagate through the culture and across time, it has to be useful enough so that people hear it, internalize it, make it part of their language, and then reuse it so that other people can reuse it. And so you can make a really powerful argument that the building blocks of language, words, are each and every one of them I hesitate to use the word parasite because it suggests that it's harmful to its host, but it's, as long as we use the word parasite in a way that's neutral, but between harmful or helpful, sure, words are mind parasites.
Thank you, Michael. Rick Pearson, you had your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
I dropped it. I was just going to tell a corny joke. Never mind.
Oh, okay. Well, we could always use a corny joke.
Yeah, I got nothing against, I told one myself.
Okay.
Now,
So
now I set it up, so it's not going to work. So never mind.
oh.
Maybe Karen?
Yeah, Karen.
But I have a follow-up question. You said that in higher education, we need to go back and rethink how we teach critical thinking in higher education. I'm sort of wondering if that isn't too late.
Oh, you're right. You're right.
Because if I look back on, I think that high school is actually the place where we need to teach critical thinking. I think we need to go back to such simple things like debate societies and teaching civics and teaching, I guess in Europe they teach religion, but they teach ethics.
Yeah.
Which is all about all the different religions and so on and so forth, because that's why I think that higher education is too late, because I'm finding when I watch parents that the way that we taught our children, or that we were taught to have dialogues, that's often not taking place because the electronic babysitter is there. So I will watch people pushing their baby carriages who are constantly on their phone. And when I think that even when my son was in his baby carriage, I would talk to him nonstop and sing to him and turn him around so that he faced me and he could see that I was speaking to him, even though he didn't understand. And all of this is dialogue. Okay.
Beautiful.
And what I'm seeing in society is less and less of this, and more children facing forward. In other words, they have no contact to form these types of conversation and dialogue. So if we don't see that, if we see the religion of their parents and the religion of society and the influence of media on their early education, and I'm going to wait until they go to college to help them rethink their way of thinking, to me, that's just too late.
You won't get any disagreement from me, Karen. I love what you're saying. I happen to mention that I happen to know that critical thinking instruction at higher education can improve, but I think it should start. I'm going to go one better, even before high school. And I guess just talking to your kids, beautiful start. But imagine something like this happening in a kindergarten classroom. You know, the teacher says, "All right, kids, come on over to the story rug." Everybody comes around, sits cross-legged. And the teacher says, "You know, little Johnny just broke the rules to help little Susie. Did Johnny do something wrong, or did he do something right?" And you get kids jumping in on both sides. "Well, you know, he did something right because he's helping." "No, he did something wrong because he broke the rules." Well, is there such a thing as a bad rule? You know, kids love these questions, and you can spark some wonderful thought-provoking conversations among them. There's actually a movement called Philosophy for Children that tries to help teachers do this kind of thing, and I think that gives me hope for the future. There's a have you guys come across the concept of street epistemology?
Yes, I was just going to bring that up. Some of us just went to training for street epistemology just recently.
With Anthony Magnabosco, I bet.
Yes. And it brought up much of what you've talked about in terms of how to talk to people. I probably don't have the right personality for it, but I'm trying to learn. And I know some of the people in here have been, and there's some disagreement among people about it, in terms of, if you never confront someone, how do you know they're learning, I guess is the question.
Yeah, I'm very impressed by what Anthony and the street epistemologists are doing. And I love the videos that show people doing it in a very gentle, affirming way, a way that doesn't make people defensive. And it demonstrates the power of real dialogue and really Socratic questioning in a powerful way. There's a street epistemologist recently posted a video on the street epistemology Facebook page or something, where his two daughters, maybe 6 and 4, he sits them down with a big bowl of strawberries and he says, "Can I ask you guys a couple questions?" And the kids say, "Sure." And he asks some questions like, is Nemo, the character of the Disney movie, is he real? And one of them goes, "Yes." And the other one goes, No, because fish don't talk." So, and the guy, instead of judging, just says, "Okay, so you're saying that because fish don't talk, Nemo isn't real, but you're saying that Nemo is real because he was in a movie?" And the other daughter says yes. And before long, the kids are turning to each other and helping each other refine their ability to think about what's real and what isn't.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful demonstration of the power of philosophy for children, I guess, and the way the father conducts it. With there's no judgment in his voice. He's just active listening and paraphrasing what the kids say and just saying, "Is this really what you're saying?" And a lot of times by just asking, "Is this really what you're saying? That Nemo's real because he's orange and orange things are real," or whatever the logic was, I forget. And the kid will often go, "Oh, wait a second." And then they'll change their mind right there. And it's beautiful. I mean, I'm sure this guy's kids are going to grow up with really supple minds, just as Karen's probably have, because she talked to them when they were little.
Yeah.
He's studying philosophy and ethics, actually, to become a teacher of philosophy and ethics.
Nice.
I had another question for you. Sorry, I hit the thing. And our science project, where we're giving science kits to children, we're going for elementary school, actually about mid-elementary, about 12. Do you think that's too late, actually? Should we be focusing on earlier?
I think that's these are science kits for middle schoolers, did I say 12 years old?
Yeah. No, late elementary school is what we're focused on.
No, I don't think that's too late. I think that's wonderful. I think that's a super project. And I just, at the beginning of the show, I was saying, wow, these guys are doing good work. I'm very pleased. I can't imagine that not inspiring some kids to go on to a life of science and inquiry, especially if it's well conducted by the teachers involved. So more power to you.
Thank you. Jim Peterson has a question again. You're muted, Jim. You're muted, Jim. I don't know why I think yelling's gonna help.
I didn't hear you. I intuited you. Anyway, yeah. In thinking about this whole problem, when I was a student at the University of South Florida, I took up philosophy, and I'm very heartened to see that people like yourself, with a lively and agile brain, have taken it up as well. And so what I'm going to ask you is somewhat subjective, and well, I became very interested in the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein, with whom you may be familiar, I suspect.
Yeah.
And what is your perspective on the future of philosophy, especially one that has a lot to do with thinking and factualities and people, yes.
Wow, great question. So there have been some influential scientists like Lawrence Krauss, who's often lionized in secular communities, who basically said philosophy is increasingly obsolete. Philosophers have been running around asking questions for thousands of years and they never come up with any answers. And meanwhile, science is making progress and answering the answerable questions. And before you know it, philosophy will be, there'll be nothing left for philosophers to think about. It'll all fade away. Now, I think he's dead wrong about that for a number of reasons. Some of them laid out beautifully by Rebecca Goldstein in her book, Plato at the Googleplex, which I recommend. She points out that, well, there are a couple of reasons. Scientists specialize primarily in testing claims against reality. So laboratory experiments, but there are always hundreds of consistency checks that need doing. Scientists do some of them, but philosophers are often very good at testing ideas against other ideas. And there's a whole lot of that that happens within science, and there's a whole hell of a lot left over to do even after all the scientists have done their idea testing. So there's going to be plenty of work around for philosophers to do. The other thing is that we need to test our claims about right and wrong, our value judgments as well. And that's been philosophy's core business going all the way back to Socrates. It's not enough to test our factual claims. We have to test our value judgments also. And the scientists haven't picked up the ball on testing value judgments. I do think that the concept of science is evolving in a way that will eventually cause it to encompass value inquiry also. The testing of claims about right and wrong will eventually become a branch of science, if you look at the way science evolves and how it has evolved in past years. And maybe when that happens, philosophy will become obsolete or synonymous with science or so fully merged with science, I don't know. But philosophy ain't going away anytime soon.
Well, it is said that philosophy is the mother of the sciences. I think
I call it the incubator of the sciences in in the book, yes.
There's actually a whole, if you Google it, there's a whole new variety of jobs for philosophers. And there's a list with all the university connections that teach different types of philosophies going into future jobs for philosophers. And I was so impressed. I sent the list to my son, because it's never discouraged him from studying it to worry about what he's going to do in the future. And there were a lot of things, and that's also, there are new philosophical jobs within IT. And of course, the whole question, philosophy and ethics and everything else that goes along with it, as far as medical science is there. If we look at the recent discussion by the Catholics about the vaccine, it can't be, you can't do the vaccine because it was tested on abortion material. These are also the kind of questions that ethics and philosophers will in the future decide. And in England, they've actually put a new course of study about 10 years ago into philosophical and ethical decisions for science in the future. So I don't think philosophy is going down the drain in any way. I think that it's adapting quite interestingly to the modern world.
Well, Karen, I hope you'll
Thank
send
you.
me a link to that jobs for philosophers listing. If my book isn't successful, I may be hunting for work.
I appreciate the comments. Please remember to raise your hand because other people are waiting to ask questions. Did you want to say anything else, Andy, about that?
Oh, yeah, I think we've just lived through a phase where in America, at least, philosophy has not been given a lot of respect. That philosophy is viewed as navel gazing, thumb twiddling, useless, doesn't bake any bread, doesn't put any food on the table. I think there's been a lot of prejudice against philosophy, but maybe that's changing now. And with luck, what Karen is tuned into is a sign of that.
Michael, you had something?
Yeah, part of what makes any parasite or virus or bacteria, anything so difficult to immunize against is because it's constantly evolving in response to the inoculation. So I was just wondering if you had any like suggestions on like a broad spectrum inoculation strategy to combat that.
Do you mean the biological parasites, or are we talking mind parasites
Well,
now?
if you know anything about biological parasites, I'm sure we could all use that one too. But
Yeah, I don't claim any expertise on the biological side, but I have no doubt that memes or ideas spawn variants. And sometimes the original variants die off and the new variants take off in the same way that some of the new COVID variants, or am I saying that right? Some of the new coronavirus variants are threatened to take off. There's Dennett, I think, was one of the people who noticed that in much of Europe, there have been sort of state-associated religions for a long time, and that has stifled sort of competition among religious worldviews in Europe. And meanwhile, and secularism has skyrocketed in much of Europe as a result. Meanwhile, in America, there's no state-sponsored religion, and so anybody who wants to can set up a church and create a new variant of religious teaching. So there's so many more religious worldviews competing for attention. Many of them die off, but other ones just spread and become successful. And arguably some of the new forms of, say, evangelical Christianity have a kind of infectiousness that some of their predecessors didn't.
Michael, do you have anything else for now?
no, I was just wondering if you had any sort of AIDS cocktail ideas on how to
Yes,
combat
please.
it.
Thanks.
Well, well, let me see if I can say a little bit more about what I think Michael is asking for here. What can we do about infectious forms of religious ideation or infectious political ideologies? Let me mention some of them. So here's some of the lessons of cognitive immunology that can help to strengthen mental immune systems. Number one, listen to your doubts and your qualms and your reservations. Those are your mind's antibodies trying to tell you something. Sometimes you'll just have a little subtle disquiet in your mind, but if you pay attention to it, you'll notice that that's trying to call attention to a deeply problematic aspect of an idea you're entertaining. So a whole number, weak mental immune systems cut out, a lot of doubts and objections because they make you feel, unsafe or something. But people with healthy mental immune systems actually listen to their doubts and their reservations, and not just their own, but other people's as well, and try to learn from them. So rule number one, if you want a strong mental immune system, is listen to your doubts and listen to other people's challenges without getting defensive. In fact, treat every challenge as an opportunity to learn rather than a threat. When somebody else's objection or challenge strikes you as a threat, your mental immune system will very likely kick into high gear and start generating pushback. But that's not a recipe for good mental immune function. So we can do as much internally by not letting ourselves get defensive as we can do by asking other people to stop saying offensive things. That's just one thing. A second thing we might teach people to reduce the infectiousness of religious ideation is we should always treat our beliefs as house guests that might wear out their welcome. Just as a house guest that you originally welcomed into your home might eventually get a little annoying and need to be shown the door, and a belief that serves you well for a certain stretch of your life might need to be modified or even rejected when you learn more. If you become attached to your beliefs and treat them as like heirloom furniture that have to be clung to tightly and passed down through the generations, you're compromising your own mental immune system. At the end of my book, I offer about a dozen of these sort of rules of thumb for strengthening your own mind's immune system. And it turns out that it's not just the religious crazies and the political crazies who can dramatically improve their mental immune function. Every single one of us has a mental immune system that's functioning at a fraction of its full potential. And in fact, you could have the best critical thinking skills higher education can provide, but if you use them to attack other people's views and not your own, or not to challenge or test your own, you've essentially become a propagandist for an ideology rather than a fair-minded thinker. So part of mental immune health is fair-mindedness. And right now, critical thinking courses in college don't teach fair-mindedness. They teach you how to dissect arguments and and turn people loose to use those skills as weapons in the culture war. That ain't gonna cut it. In fact, culture wars are deeply corrosive of mental immune health. If you treat reasons as weapons, if you treat questions as weapons, you might win some short-term argument gains, but you're doing it at the expense of your long-term learning and intellectual growth. We should always reason to find out, never reason to win. This is a handful of some of the how-to suggestions I offer. There are many more in the book.
Thank you, Michael. Amy?
Okay, I have a really stupid question, but why not Dr. Andrew Norman on the book? Why Andy Norman? I know it's really intellectual. So
yeah, I've always struggled with this. So when I was a kid, I wanted everybody to call me Andrew because I sounded more important and more grown up. And now that I'm a grown up, I ask everybody to call me Andy because it makes me feel young. So that's part of the answer, I think. The other pieces, I guess I didn't want to come across as pretentious. I would like for my message to resonate with even with people who may not have had the benefit of a pricey education. And I don't like to kind of flaunt the fact that I was very privileged and fortunate in my education. Some of the public intellectuals that I admire the most, they don't put PhD or doctor on their book jackets either, because they don't need to, right? And so I'm trying to be like them.
I had a feeling it was humility. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm going to give Jim Young his 1 minute warning, and then I'm going to ask a question in the interim, unless he's ready to go. I'm curious as to how, if critical thinking and scientists are so advanced, how did we end up with the experiments that doctors used against people and Nazi experimentation against people, and the kind of the scientists who decided to promote smoking because it was not bad for you? How do we not become those people that assume we're right?
Yeah, so you can be extremely good at testing factual claims and just completely uninterested in developing your own moral understanding, right? So Nazi doctors might have been extremely good scientists, but but that's only part of being being able to think clearly and reason clearly and well about facts and evidence is not enough to be a good person, I think. In the book, I point to a curious fact about the 9/11 hijackers. They pulled off an extraordinarily sophisticated logistical feat by hijacking 4 or 5 airliners and navigating them into their targets. They were not dumb people,
Right.
but their moral compasses were completely haywire. So logistical intelligence and savvy can coexist in the same mind with moral delusion of a very high order. And it's not enough to educate one half of the mind and neglect the other half. But that's just a few thoughts off the top of my head.
Thank you. Jim Young, are you ready, or do I need to?
I'm ready.
Okay, you go.
I have an inquiry or a comment, and then I have a question. With respect to the teaching of critical thinking concepts, I have watched a number of videos. I've purchased some books from the Foundation for Critical Thinking, books authored by Dr. Linda Elder. I have not found anything in the material that I have studied that suggested that critical thinking should be used as a weapon in debates, but rather the emphasis seemed to be, as you indicated should be, that people need to recognize their egocentric self and prejudiced biases and our sociocentric biases, and set aside those biases and do the research, ask questions, and accumulate as much information as possible. So that's just an observation I make. I don't know who is teaching critical thinking as a weapon to use in debates, but I'm sure there's probably somebody that out there that might be. The other question that I had was, years ago, I went to a seminar. Dr. Theodore Schick was the speaker, and he was talking about philosophers and doing philosophy. He has a book by that name, which I was very interested in. He made the statement that essentially there were no atheist philosophers. Well, I thought that was an extraordinary statement. I asked him after the meeting to confirm that, and he said, yeah, there's nobody seriously in philosophy that are believers in the supernatural. And so I started using this talking point, and immediately was corrected by a number of other people who said, well, here's this philosopher, he's world renowned and he's a theologian and he believes in God. So I had to stop making that, I had to discard that talking point.
Yes.
So since you're a philosopher, I'm going to now come back to you and say, would you please address this issue? Are there really world renowned philosophers that are promoting, that believe, and because it seems to me that anybody could claim they're a philosopher. I could say, hey, I'm a philosopher.
Yes, no, that's a fine question. I do think that the discipline of philosophy can be hard on or corrosive of religious belief. In fact, I think it tends to go that way. But there are many well-credentialed, very smart, well-respected people who've earned their stripes in the field of philosophy and who argue for religious positions and profess, I think with great sincerity, their religious belief. Alvin Plantinga at Notre Dame is one of them. The guy took me rock climbing one time, and while I was struggling up with a top rope and with very little faith, he clambered up another rock face with no top rope and a great deal of faith. So I'm convinced his faith was very real. Plantinga has been very influential in arguing that beliefs don't need to be evidence-based to be rational. And I argue in the book that he's wrong about that in an important way. But no, that there are religious philosophers. Regarding your first question, yeah, I didn't mean to say, I hope if I said that critical thinking instruction teaches people to weaponize or reasons and arguments, I misspoke. Most of the critical thinking textbooks that I've reviewed and taught from are and I know Linda Elder's work. These are people who are doing really good work, and they're trying to teach. What they're offering is what they they tend to describe what they're offering as a set of tools. And tools are, by definition, a means to an end. And so when you hand somebody a set of tools and leave it up to them to how they're going to use them, they can choose to use them for good, or they can use them for evil, religious apologetics are people who practice religious apologetics take critical thinking skills and they use them to defend the faith. They say, I'm going to use arguments to poke holes in your views, but I refuse to let your arguments poke any holes in my views. And the asymmetry, the hypocrisy there, I think, makes religious apologetics a deeply morally problematic exercise. But no, almost all critical thinking instruction, almost all critical thinking textbooks mean well. It's just they're focused on a piece of the problem rather than the whole problem. And so sometimes what they impart is misused by the graduates, by the students that learn them.
I found that to be the case with sophistry.
Good.
Thank you, Jim. Did you want to make any closing statements, Andy?
Well, you guys have been a genuine pleasure. I love your questions, and it's been a lot of fun.
Great. We're so glad to have you. Thank you so much. I will tell people that next week we will have someone from Humanity Plus. So it's going to be quite a contrast, I think, from this group, from this talk, but it should be quite interesting to challenge our views on some things and whether humanity can be augmented with machines, not machines, but electronics. So thank you all very much for coming, and we will see you next week. Thank you, Dr. Norman, and I will have your video up tomorrow and I'll send you a link to it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks for
everyone.
helping us realize that we all matter.
Thanks, Judy, for
Yes, we
organizing.
do all matter. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Judy.
Oh, you're
Great.
welcome. Thank
Thank
you.
you.